We have two fantastic representations from Latin America here today, and an interesting comparison and contrast between the ambassador is here from Costa Rica as well as the ambassador from the Dominican Republic, and we are very grateful for both of them to take time out of their very busy schedules to come and talk to our audience today. Our moderator for this session is Wade Channel. Wade and I met at another cyber event, actually. We had to go all the way to Kansas to actually meet one another. But Wade is, I think you'll find he is a very interesting, fascinating speaker. I know he very much captured the imagination of everyone at the Kansas conference, and so I know he will with you as well. Wade is an economic development expert specializing in the use of law and legal reform to stimulate economic growth. A senior legal reform advisor for USAID, Wade has more than 20 years of experience in identifying legal and institutional constraints to private sector activity and economic freedom. He's worked extensively in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia on economic reform projects, and has lived in Brazil, Guinea-Bissau, Croatia, and Belgium. And while in Croatia, Wade also served as president of the American Chamber of Commerce, AmCham. What I've asked Wade to do is to prepare a couple of introductory remarks to sort of set the tone and stage for this chat. The topic of this session, as you recall, is the challenges and opportunities of institutional reform. So Wade's going to give us a couple of remarks for about 20 minutes, and then he'll ask the ambassadors to join him for more of a roundtable discussion about the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesl. It's really a privilege to be here. I'm going to be talking, as I begin, tell you a little bit about some history of USAID, but I do need to tell you that even though I wear a USAID name tag, I do not speak officially for the United States government or for the U.S. Agency for International Development. They may or may not agree with what I have to say, but the great thing about being here is that I get to say it whether we decide ahead of time whether we agree on these things or not. So I'm not saying that anyone disagrees with me, but I'm not saying that they do either. These are my opinions, and I'm privileged to get to share them. About 10 years ago, USAID started looking at the multitude of investment that was going on in the former Soviet Union, the newly independent states, in legal reform. All kinds of laws were being passed: contract, company, bankruptcy, securities, lots of securities reform, penal code reform, but you name it, we were doing it. But we weren't happy. The results were suboptimal. The problem was that though we were helping to draft and rewrite and to reformulate laws, people weren't using them. There was what we called an implementation gap, but not only that, the purpose of the law supposedly was economic growth and economic development, and we didn't see a connection between what we were doing with the laws and what was happening on the ground. That caused a very honest and for me, something that captured my imagination. I was then a consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton. USAID came to Booz Allen and said, help us think about what we should be doing differently because this isn't working. At that time, Douglas North's New Institutional Economics School was getting a lot of attention. People were looking at institutions and how they had an impact on development and other things. And Mark Belcher, who ran our shop at Booz Allen, was a great reader of economics and was aware of this. And he and Nick Cleesis at USAID began to look at the institutional aspects. This, I think, was extremely significant for us. But before I mention that, I just want to define institution for a minute. My problem with Douglas North is not how he thinks. It's that he's taken a word that I've used all my life and given it a new meaning that I don't immediately adjust to. For me, an institution has bricks and mortars, payroll, they're closed on public holidays. You can see them, you can go there. For him, they're not necessarily visible. They are the ways that we work together, the unspoken, unwritten, possibly undiscussed rules and forms of behavior and cultural aspects that are a major part of our lives, even if we don't see them. And I think of one example, which is the institution of the handshake. In America, for a man, it's a firm, strong handshake, and you know that. With a woman, you're a little easier on the hand. Don't squeeze too hard. A woman with too hard a handshake is sort of back away a little bit. Who has told us all these things? We're going to read about this? Well, probably somebody in this room may have done research on this kind of thing, or certainly at this institution, but we don't talk about this. In West Africa, there's 6 different handshakes at least that you run into. There's the hand under the elbow to support it. There's the hand on the forearm, under the forearm, 2 hands together, both hands together. Ethiopia, you get the handshake with the bump, if you're a good friend. My favorite is in a lot of Muslim countries, the handshake with the various form of touching the elbow or forearm somewhere, followed by to the heart. I really like that one. But it's an institution to Douglas North. I mean, it's not really, but I'm getting there. I'm working on it. So I'm going to try to get there with you as well. But as you can imagine, those of us who are looking at institutions with that kind of approach, we started by just looking at the traditional institutions. So we added to our mix of development issues implementing institutions. Who is it that's responsible for implementing the laws? Government agencies. For example, enforcement. You have courts. To enforce a contract, you go to courts, you go to bailiffs. These are government agencies, institutions that are responsible. The anti-monopoly agency will be responsible for competition issues. Other agencies treat other aspects. And USAID invested quite a lot in these kinds of organizations following their initial investment in laws, as well as other donors were doing this. And we came up to another problem, which it still didn't seem to be very effective. Lots of investment in courts that didn't seem to show much. In fact, some of it seemed to be just really helping courts to do their own thing faster. It didn't really affect the outcome that we were seeking, which was more efficient system of justice. So we began to look at what we call supporting institutions. And the supporting institutions are those institutions within civil society, public or private, mostly private, that you need for the system to work. Going back to enforcement, when you have a disagreement, the first place you go is not the court. And just because there's a lot of focus on that in development, that's not the first place anyone goes. Before you ever get to the disagreement, the enforcement system includes credit agencies. Would you dare risk lending money to me? First you find out. Lawyers who know how to draft an enforceable contract, because sometimes the contracts aren't good. Ran into that in Croatia. Judges said, enforcement, how do you enforce this stuff? These are meaningless contracts, they're poorly drafted. Management, that's actually looking to see if bills are paid. Are they 6 months late before they notice somebody's past due? It's hard to collect half a year after somebody hasn't paid you. What about collection agencies? What about negotiators? What about alternative dispute resolution? All of these are the kinds of supporting institutions, along with think tanks, universities, who's teaching the new laws, accounting groups, bankers associations, you name it, freight forwarders. These are part of the institutions. So we began to look at those. And what's interesting is you go to some countries, you find they're missing, that they're very few. You'll find a chamber of commerce, but it's not what we think of, which is a voluntary organization. It's a state organization that requires a tax, that everybody has to pay a tax for this organization to work. That's a very different structure, and it doesn't necessarily serve the interest of those who are forced to pay this as a cost of doing business. So sometimes it does, but not always. Anyway, in looking at all of these, we also realized that we hadn't gotten there. And I think that's where we got into the Douglas North way of thinking. But we chose our own term. We call it the social dynamics or the market for reform. Who cares? So there's a need to change the competition law. Who cares? Well, vested interests care very much because they're about to lose their market. People going into business care very much because it's the only hope they have if they can break up cartels and monopolies. Some government champions will care. The consumers should care. So do people care? Is there demand for the reform? Is there demand against the reform? And who is demanding what? This, to me, has been the most important aspect of the rethinking we've done. Because we've passed laws. We've worked with countries to pass laws. They pass laws without us. I'm not taking the blame for all the laws that take place. But, I look at Pakistan. In Pakistan, a woman has the right to inherit property, up to a third of the property of her father. She dare not do so because the institutions of culture say, don't you do that. That goes to your brother. You'll get your share from the husband that you someday marry. If you have to marry. She can't enforce it. Rwanda, the same problem is happening. You cannot enforce the new law that says women have equal inheritance rights. So there's actually a project to sue people constantly because the judges won't enforce the law. They don't think it's appropriate. It doesn't fit into their thinking. You know, in Latin America and some countries, inequality is very high because of the institution of the patron system that was implemented 500 years ago that put most of the economic power in a very small elite. And most countries haven't broken that system. Many are still suffering with very high Gini coefficient inequality indices that relate back 500 years. I think for myself, as I look at these things and the different institutions, the different issues that we need to deal with to reform the system that will allow economic growth and opportunity, there is one thing that really stands out to me, and I'm beginning to see it in others, but maybe not quite the way you would think. In a recent book, Kenneth Downe, The Law Growth Nexus, breaks out the importance, the utter importance of enforceable contract and property rights as the basis for economic growth, as well as the basics for a lot of civil liberties. In a few years before that, Richard Pipes in Property and Freedom discusses property as the basis for human rights, essentially. Economic growth, democratic rights, accountable government, having property that cannot be dispossessed without appropriate reasons. Hernando de Soto has made property extremely high profile in the Mystery of Capital, where he shows the importance of title to reinvigorate what he calls dead capital, land and other things that can't be used because the property rights aren't there. So at this point, you're thinking, of course, what I really want to emphasize here is property. No, I want to emphasize government. Because these rights are defined and enforced, or they're not enforced by the institution of government. Without an enforcement system that is legitimate, considered legitimate, respected, the rights, which we may or may not appreciate, depending on how they're set up, are either, well, they're essentially nothing more than good ideas. If you can't enforce a right, it's not a right. It's a nice aspiration. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is neither universal nor effective in many countries. It's a great idea, but many of these ideas have never gotten off the paper. In Zimbabwe today, land rights are not something I put money into. It's not enforceable, or I would say that probably only enforceable until there's a regime change, and then we're going to see some changes. What is the role of government as we look at economic development and social change? What's the role of the private sector in this? I want to go a little off the normal kind of lawyerly talk and suggest that it depends on what the goal is. What's the role of government to do what? What's the role of the private sector to do what? And I don't want to push that back even a little more and suggest that there's a fundamental place where that comes from. We do have at USAID, at World Bank, if you get to walk in the front door, now the security makes you walk in the side door. But when you used to be able to walk in the front door, the first thing you saw on the wall was a world without poverty. It is the declaration of what they're showing up there for every day. The folks who work there get to walk by it and be reminded every day. So the rest of us who don't get to see it. But the fact is, economic growth, opportunity, poverty reduction have become the international standards of what we're striving for in the development community, but even in the European community, in the Mercosur community, in the ASEAN community. These are the goals that we're looking for. But these standards arise from institutions, cultural norms, where we have agreed that these things are important for a variety of reasons. And they represent worldviews, presuppositions, untested assumptions. I would like to propose a premise, and that is that the role of government within this goal depends essentially on the nature of those governed, human nature itself. And just to get my bias out there, I will let you know, I tend to come from a traditional Judeo-Christian standpoint that I've found to be very explanatory over the last few thousand years for a lot of things in government and elsewhere, which is this idea that human beings were created in God's image and therefore capable of amazing things, and yet tainted, fallen, corrupted somehow and therefore capable of some of the most unimaginable atrocities. And you don't have to read too many newspapers to see both ends of the spectrum, although papers sell more when they report on the second part of that than when they report on all the good things that can happen. If that's the case, that's a characteristic, this characterization of human potential is reasonably accurate. To me, that affects the role of government. And it's essentially that the role of government is to facilitate human capabilities and to control or to guard against human frailties. In the economic context, more specifically, the role of government is to facilitate commerce and control corruption. Unfortunately, if you take a look at the Doing Business Guide, at the UNDP indices, the Misery Index, the World Bank World Development Report, Index of Economic Freedom, you'll find there's a reversal. The role of government should be, in my mind, to facilitate commerce and control government and control corruption. But in many places, the role of government is to facilitate corruption and control commerce. And you can see it in every economic and human development indicator that we carry. So what does this have to do with today's topic, institutional reform? I've sort of gone far aside. Am I ever going to shut up and let these ambassadors talk? I want to suggest that the government's facilitative role is to establish legitimate rights and rules that permit individuals to seek opportunities. Ashraf Ghani has recently put this in a book with Clara Lockhart, that development is about seeking opportunity. I like that, but to do that, it requires legitimate rights and rules that can be enforced. Legitimacy is established to me on three fronts: substance, process, and representation. On the substance side, it's simply, does the rule make sense? Does it work? If you're putting into place a banking system and your banking law doesn't work, then substantively it's illegitimate. It could be a perfect law. Then you get into other issues of legitimacy. How was it passed? Does the country expect, does the average citizen expect to have a voice in these things, through a representative or directly, doesn't matter. And was it done by fiat? Was it done through an interactive process? That is the process issue of legitimacy, because when you violate the process, people are upset. If somebody gives you a great rule, but ignored your feelings on it, you may actually resist the rule, even if you prefer it, because you have been offended at the illegitimacy of the way it was handled. The representation is about who is making the rules. And this becomes significant not so much in our individual country context, but in the development context, when frequently the rule makers, the rule definers and writers, fly in for a few weeks and help draft something and fly home. And in an Islamic country, if they're not Muslim, it's inherently suspect whether they are sticking with the values of the local society. Maybe it's the right rule, and maybe it's done in the right process, but maybe it's illegitimate because the wrong people took center stage on it. Sometimes we see this in reverse. I would like to suggest that Hugo Chavez is an example of representational legitimacy. He has, in my mind, violated the substance of the laws of his country by changing it into something that is crashing the economy and increasing the level of corruption. I dare say the process was violated, but when he came into a country with a division where the majority of people said this system doesn't work, we're being cheated, there's an elite doing this, doing things wrong, and he, by the power of his personality, said, yes, this is true, we're going to change it. And we're going to change it to, unfortunately, another extreme. There were lots of other options, but by the power of his personality, he was able to violate substance and right and process and create essentially what has become a less legitimate form of government in the eyes of many Venezuelans. So let me conclude and draw this together. Government is essential to economic growth and development because it negotiates society's dreams and aspirations in the form of policies and rules. Its development goal is to facilitate economic activity and control corrupting influences. To do this, government must establish legitimacy in substance, process, and representation. Policy and law that we talk about cover pretty much every conceivable topic, from global warming to how to package cabbages. And yet, of all the thousands of laws you can think of, they regulate only one thing, and that's human relationships, period. And this is where I find hope in development. Because what I see institutionally taking place in numerous countries worldwide is a change in relationships between government and governed, between ruler and ruled. The move from subject to citizenship, from rights, or to rights, from a position of victimization in many really poorly developed countries. I think Guinea-Bissau, where I live, which has been declared the world's first African narco state, it's been sold off to drug traffickers. I see change. I see Macedonia reaching out to the private sector, the central bank calling up banks and saying, how can we do things differently? And then doing them and making it better. Rwanda, President Kagame has the Purpose-Driven Nation initiative going. If you're familiar with Purpose-Driven Life, that's what he's working from. He's got the Purpose-Driven Nation, and one of the mandates of all of his ministers are input, feedback from the private sector. Talk to the people that you claim to rule. The World Bank's Doing Business report, I think, has been fantastic, not because of the accuracy of any given country's indicators. We would argue about that for the rest of our lives. But it has blown the cover off. Today, business knows what's wrong. They've always known, but government knows what's wrong. There is a basis for discussion between business and government. And in the past 5 years since Doing Business has come out, there have been literally hundreds of reforms driven by the awareness that we have to talk to each other as government and private sector again. There are exceptions to hopeful signs. Zimbabwe is one. Venezuela could be one. That's probably more debatable. But even these changes highlight the contrast of what government should be, what it can be, what it ought to be. The reforms themselves that are coming are not easy, full of challenges. How do we change these problems? How do we deal with vested interests who don't want to change an elite structure, for example, or competing legitimately different expectations? How do we do that? Where do we go to make the changes that we need to make? Well, the nice part is I get to quit here and hand that question over to our ambassadors, who will now come up and we will talk about some of the practical approaches and practical problems of making institutional changes in countries. Gentlemen.
We have two very interesting perspectives for this particular panel. Both of the ambassadors have extensive experience not only in terms of their public sector service, but also on the private side as well. Ambassador Tomas Buenas from Costa Rica has served as the CEO of ESCO, a regional leader in the design, rental, and sale of construction systems, and he served as chairman of the board of directors and executive committee of Costa Rica Investment and Development Board, CINDE. He's also served as the country's Minister of Economics, as well as the Minister of Foreign Trade. He served as vice chairman of the WTO ministerial meeting in Doha in 2001. He has served as Costa Rica's chief negotiating minister in the talks of the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. Has played an active role in negotiations and enactment of many other free trade agreements for his country. Ambassador Flavio Espinal joins us. He also was the ambassador of the Dominican Republic to the Organization of the American States in 1996 to 2000. He's practiced law in the cities of Santiago and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic and has served as a consultant for both the private sector and international organizations such as the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations Program on Development, and the Organization of American States. In fact, his book, The Constitutionalism and Political Processes in the Dominican Republic, has received several awards. He also has an extensive academic background, including being dean of a law school and running several research centers. So please join me in welcoming our prestigious panel.
Well, you're no strangers to institutional reform. So let me just throw out, we were talking beforehand. You mentioned some experiences of Costa Rica in bringing private sector, public sector, rethinking these Douglas North institutions. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity of speaking with you. I value it very much. I have great admiration for the United States academic community, and I certainly feel very honored to be here. Costa Rica, yes, it's a small country, as you know, only 4 million people. The area of Costa Rica is about the size of West Virginia, but we certainly have tried to make a difference. Costa Rica faced in 1981 a great challenge because our system, our political system, together with our economical system, practically collapsed. Because we were in the mode, like many of the Latin American countries, in the mode thinking that protectionism would work. We thought that by closing access to our markets and only having and developing small markets like the Central American Common Market, that we were going to be able to sustain our social net, which in Costa Rica is quite ambitious, as you know, because we have free education and free health for all of the inhabitants of the country as a right, and it collapsed, and so we had to meet with the demands of building up the country, and in that sense, it was a great challenge to build up and to modernize our institutions. So, with the help of the United States AID, we were able in 1981 to confront those challenges, and we put together, among others, CINDE, which is the Costa Rican Development Board, a private institution that stands between the government and the productive sector, and it stands in between. And it has this purpose of linking the needs of the private sector or productive sector and proposing those needs to the government, and helping the government develop answers, if you want, that in many cases cause institutional reform. So institutional reform in Costa Rica has been the key, I would say, the backbone of the development of a sustainable development that Costa Rica has had for the last 25 years.
Ambassador Espinal, you have been very involved in a new constitution. And from my experience in Brazil's constitution writing in the 80s, there's probably no greater focal battleground of all of the different interests of a society can bring together. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges?
Yeah, thank you again. It's a privilege for me to be here sharing with you this panel. I think in Latin America in general, in my country in particular, there is this sense of too much expectation about constitutions. People think that writing good constitutions are the key to development, to solve the questions of development. And every sector of society wants to put their own little thing into the constitution, and somehow at the end will come something that will satisfy everybody, and that every conceivable right, economic, social, environmental, cultural right, and all type of new form of political demand will be expressed in the constitution. And it's a strong belief in the magic of legal reform. And I think in my experience, at least in the last wave of constitutional reform that we're actually in the process of doing, is that I feel all these forces trying to get their own input into the constitution, and my fear is that in the end we're going to have something that is unworkable, a document that is unworkable. From a more perspective of how to conceive a constitution, also in Latin America, there is this idea of change as a mythical moment that a legal instrument will be able to bring about a new life, tomorrow morning, Monday morning, and that will be achieved through a beautiful constitution. instead of taking a more incremental approach to reform. So it's a battle about what institutions we're going to put in the constitution, we're going to design that could work, that could make the democracy better and fundamental rights more protected. That's one thing, and the other thing is to kind of change the mind of the people and to change the pattern of behavior as you were talking at the beginning. So we have this confluence of the legal element and the practical aspect. So that's the way I see things. It's
Yeah, you remind me in talking about the belief in law. Ulysses Guimarães, a senator in the Brazilian parliament, I think in the early 1980s, facetiously suggested that the solution for Brazil was to outlaw poverty. And fortunately, people did know that that was a joke. But there are times when that approach seems a little bit too much hope in the law itself.
And that's the reason why you see in many countries in Latin America that have gone through constitutional processes, you have long constitutions, like 400, 500 articles, and each section has details as if it was a ordinary law, or it's when in fact the constitution you have the general framework of things, and instead of all these little aspects.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I'm from the South, and I discovered that the post-Civil War constitutions of the southern states are exactly what you're describing. In Texas, the tax rate for school districts is set in the Constitution. Why? Because the southern losers, we lost the war, I come from a conquered people, were afraid. They didn't trust the North to do things right, so they got every protection possible in the Constitution, which makes me ask, from your positions, both from private sector background and public sector background, how do you build trust? How do you build trust of the government so that, and we'll get to taxes later, so that people are actually willing to pay taxes, actually willing to enforce?
I think that the basic point is creating certainty. Business people in general, productive people in general, are not willing to invest or transfer technology, knowledge, or whatever, if you don't have certainty. And I think that this is something that we have learned to value. In Costa Rica, once again, we were one of the first countries in all of Latin America to fall into the crisis, and therefore one of the first to come out of the crisis. So we have a plenty amount of years of creating, if you want, value through institutional reform. But the first thing that you want to create is certainty, because in a certain environment, business, production, enterprise will grow, and so you have to make a very strong effort to create that certainty through a framework, even a basic one. But you have to have a basic institutional structure so that you can build on and that you can create certainty. Because certainty is absolutely fundamental for business to flourish. And that certainty also has to be, or that framework has to be competitive. You were mentioning that a few minutes ago, and that's our great challenge. Today, through the internet and through knowledge, like you people quite well know, knowledge is something that is transmitted. It is fast to the tips of your fingers and to your eyes and to your brain, and so you have to be competitive through the globalization process. So that institutional reform also has to be competitive. So it's a series of things that are very basic, but that sometimes are easier said than done. I have seen that from the private sector. I'm a businessman actually in the public administration, and now I'm in the public administration looking at the other side, and it has been a wonderful thing. So you can be very practical. in this. And you must be very practical because the world, as you know very well, globalization is changing the world every single day.
Well, I think in my country, we face some challenges, and I think they're common in other Latin American countries. On the one hand, there is some people call it a crisis of credibility in some of the macro political institutions. People don't trust the political parties or the Congress, the presidency. All the polls say the level of credibility of Congress is 15%, 10%, or the same for the political parties. So at that macro level, there is this kind of crisis of credibility. Ordinary people think that they all just think about themselves, their own interests, their own parties, and so on and so forth. But on the more micro level, in the day-to-day functioning of society, doing business, and initiating an economic activity, and people face state institutions, public institutions that also have deficiencies. Sometimes there are no, human resources there are not well trained. Sometimes there is some level of corruption. Sometimes you have institutions that are totally obsolete because they're not responding to the challenge of the time. So you really have challenges at that level too. Now, how do you change all that and then build trust? Of course, I don't have an answer for that. If we had the answer, we will be further ahead down the road of development. But I think I come back to the approach of incremental change, not thinking that this can be achieved overnight because somebody heroically, pronounced a big speech and everybody was so happy, went to sleep, feeling good, or that because you write the best constitution using the best mind that you have. It's going to be a lot of changes in behavior, pattern of behavior, and then the question of certainty, transparency, improving institutions. And I think in the Dominican Republic, we've made some progress. I would say even more, considerably progress in improving areas of the state where things are much better now than they used to be. But I acknowledge that we have challenges ahead of us.
Rule of law is key, by the way. Also, the rule of law is absolutely
rule of law,
fundamental.
transparency.
Because once again, if you have in incremental change, if you decide to concentrate in a few aspects in creating that certainty, rule of law is absolutely fundamental. So that the business community, the productive community, the citizen or whatever, at least knows what the environment is going to be. And the rule of law, of course, it implies that the rule of law is going to be the same for everyone. Because as once again you suggested a few minutes ago, if you have laws or rules that are applied in a different way, that doesn't help at all. And it's just a joke.
In the Dominican Republic, Ambassador Espinal, this idea of incorporating civil society into the reforms, bringing, I guess, what Transparency International, the World Bank, and many in this room refer to as voice. How do you see your own government these days increasing voice? Because clearly sometimes trust is a matter of feeling that someone's listened to you. And if they haven't heard you, then of course they haven't listened to you. How do you bring them in?
This is civil society versus government. It's been a big issue in Latin America over the last 10 years. And again, there is a lot of resentment on the part of governments towards civil society organizations because these organizations are always on the critical mood of criticizing governments for human rights failures or for corruption or for not doing enough in the environment, for this and that. And then the political class responds saying, these people think they represent the people, who elected them, and there is this divide and lack of trust on both sides. In the Dominican Republic, we've had good experiences in engaging with the civil society in reform. Two areas, for instance, judicial reform and electoral reform. Two areas where we were really doing very badly in the past. the judicial sector justice sector was very corrupt, politicized, responding to narrow interest. For years was very inefficient. And in the mid-90s, there was a major attempt to, not attempt, there was a process of reform that started actually changing the Constitution in '94, but the change established in the Constitution did not come about in practical terms until one day the president of the country, that actually was President Fernandez, Leonardo Fernandez was in office at that time, he decided to open up the process and say, okay, we want to change the judicial process, how we select judges, how we make this more transparent. And the decision was to allow civil society to propose names for judges, to render evaluation of the people who were being considered to be members of the Supreme Court, and things like that. And there was, at the end, everything culminated in a publicized and a televised event in which those who had to make the decision, kind of a council integrated by the president and leaders of Congress, who had to make the decision who were going to be members of the Supreme Court, they had to do it without break in front of the nation with the participation and observance of the civil society. So they couldn't do deal behind the doors. And there was an interesting moment when some members of the opposition told the president, let's take a break. They wanted to kind of get some deals. He said, no, people are watching. People they don't want to go to sleep. So let's do it. It's a kind of a joke there. But it was very important. In electoral reform also, we had a very bad experience in electoral fraud and things like that. And since mid-90s, but especially 2000, 2002 and up to date, there has been important changes in the electoral system. And civil society has been key, especially some institutions that were created at some point, by the way, with the good support of USAID in both sectors, justice and electoral sectors, in terms of making recommendations for changes in the law, and changes in regulations, changes in administration, electoral administration, in observation. There is now a system that everybody accepts of electoral observation, permanent electoral observation from Dominican institutions that have a system very well in place. So I think that it's been positive. It's been very positive. Now we have to conclude these remarks in area of development. Some of the questions that you have posed to us before in written have to do with facing the challenge of poverty. There are some programs that are relying on civil society organizations that are less visible because they are in small communities, rural communities, but nonetheless play an important role in keeping those communities together and relating with state institutions.
You're hitting transparency as a major issue, which I think is significant. I reminded again that recently I got to go to Berlin. I saw the Reichstag, where their parliament is walled by glass. You know the moment you walk into the building that this is transparent everywhere you go. And I think what you've said is very significant in how you change the judicial system by becoming transparent. But there's a baseline where sometimes society expects things from government that government's not particularly good at. And you discussed a mental change that went place, because distrust breaks down when expectations fail. But if the expectations are wrong, then we have a bigger problem than just the failure of them. How did you deal with this in Costa Rica? You talked about a pretty significant change.
Yes, I have to start out by saying that something that all of you know, that there is great resistance today for change. And politically, it's even more, because now you have, as you mentioned, and Ambassador Espinal mentioned, you have the participation of an open society. You are supposed to do all of these things in a very open way. So many things can go wrong, and people certainly become comfortable or have vested interests, and they don't want to change. And so sometimes politically it becomes a huge challenge to propose change and even to achieve it. And in the case of Costa Rica, it has been a very interesting one, in the sense that don't think that we have been as mature as knowing or reading about Costa Rica suggests. many of our changes have come about through our international commitments. This is interesting. By joining the WTO, Costa Rica made and decided to, by joining and being a serious member of the WTO, that demanded institutional reform. That demanded to look into the rights of consumers. That demanded transparency for business creation. That demanded a law to protect the rights of other parties, and that demanded proposals to attract and maintain international economic investment. And then CAFTA is much more than trade. I think that the greatest value that I give to CAFTA is the institutional reform commitment that CAFTA makes compulsory in exchange to preferential access to the U.S. market. I think that it was very, very clever. I think that it is very, very far-reaching. It has not been discussed. It didn't appear in the discussion of the referendum for CAFTA in Costa Rica, because people are not interested in how is this going to result, but they want the immediacy. And the immediacy of a free trade agreement is market access. But in the case of CAFTA, this very clever scheme was you commit yourself to institutional reform, and I will give you preferential access to the most sophisticated and largest market in the world. So I think that has been a very great incentive for Costa Rica to move along institutional reform that sometimes, as the ambassador suggests, is very difficult to obtain politically.
On the political side, did it help that you could point to WTO or CAFTA as the one to blame, in the sense that government could no longer do some of the things that probably weren't the best, probably better left to the private sector, but it was a habit of government to do these things for various reasons. And suddenly you have someone says that government can't do this if you want to play by these rules. Was that helpful politically?
Very much, very, very much. And in a sense, it aligned everyone, because in Costa Rica, there is a very, like in the US, there is a very important gap between powers. The legislative power is completely independent from the executive and completely independent from the judicial. And you have to be able to align all of those powers in the same way, so that your commitment to these institutions or these free trade agreements or whatever are consistent. So that, once again, that the international commitment is important. And because you also at the same time have to sell the idea, which is a very good one, that if you're going to participate in the international community, you'd rather be a serious, even small, but very serious country in that process.
I have a fellow lawyer with me, so this is a good opportunity. And Mystery of Capital, Fernando de Soto, said one thing that I found to be shamefully and remarkably true, that frequently reform is resisted most by the legal community in a given country. Lawyers who are used to doing things a certain way, and they're not really looking at the bigger picture. Have you found the legal community to be more of a help or a hindrance, and how do you deal with lawyers to bring them on board to help drive the kinds of changes that the society needs?
Yeah, there have been changes in my country. I think about in everything, in terms of the legal codes, the criminal code, the commercial code, the environmental law, and everything. There has been changes. Some of them major changes, and the criminal justice system, for instance, was reformed as part of a wave in Latin America of adopting more the type of criminal procedure that the U.S. has and the Anglo have, of more adversarial and oral than the old system that was more closed, that had phases in the process that were secret, and everything is gone. All of that is gone. Now it's oral, more practical, more rights to the accused, and that was a major reform. And there was and there still is resistance in important segments of the legal community. In some cases, some of the criticism are actually right, in my perspective, are correct. But in principle, it has to do with certain habits of doing things that they didn't want to change, because the way it was before was, the way they did things, and it was fine with them. I would say so, that there is always a resistance in the legal community, even though sectors of the legal community have made good contributions to reform, and actually some of the proposals have come from civil society organizations that have devoted themselves to think about these issues and come up with ideas.
As a business person, you've never run into trouble with lawyers, I presume, so.
My wife is a lawyer.
Very good. Incentives are one of the things that government gets to adjust a lot. Laws change the way business runs, whether the business is going to work, and one of those things is taxation. On the one hand, for government to provide the services it needs to provide, there has to be money to pay for it. On the other hand, every tax is a business cost that can threaten the success of a business. Whether it's a mom and pop shop or a multinational, all of them have to absorb and pass on to some extent in a increasingly globally competitive society. They have to deal with these costs. How do you balance funding the needed social aspirations of the Costa Rican safety net, as well as just regular day-to-day things, with the fact that too much tax will kill off the cow that's giving the milk, essentially, that you can kill the milk cow or kill the goose that laid the old golden egg. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that?
It's a great challenge, and I have some experience in that field, because not only as president of the Costa Rican Development Board, we were suggesting constantly to the government how to attract that foreign direct investment. And one of that, obviously, foreign direct investment makes a case of taxes and of incentives, of course. But then also I was trade minister, so I was on the other side. And I think that that is a great challenge. And in general terms, I think that there are certain things that you have to be able to do or to achieve. The first is that you have to, today, in this very competitive society, you have to be competitive, and so the tax rate has to be a competitive one. By the way, I'm surprised that the U.S. still continues to attract so much investment with a 35 or 40% tax rate. It's just incredible. Well, why? Well, because the rule of law in the United States is so strong. But certainly, it is becoming an exception. And as you know, the other extreme is that small countries that have become important ones in the last 10, 15 years, basically these Central European countries, today most have adopted flat tax rates that are very competitive, 10, 15, 12%, etc. Ireland did the same and became a giant in the European Union. But so Costa Rica has had this challenge of, first of all, and this discussion that we must have a competitive rate. We are still in that discussion. Although we have been able to attract many foreign direct investment under a scheme that the WTO has determined that will be eliminated in, I think, 2012, which is the free zone area, and that Dominican Republic also has the same, by which you attract these companies, these foreign companies or national companies, to produce on the basis of exporting, and you give them a tax haven for up to 12 years. and that was within the rules of WTO. Once again, that is going to change. So countries like ours have the challenge of changing the laws and making them the tax rates one for general. It has to be the same for everyone. But to finalize, the other part of this medal is to sit down with the investors, which mostly are multinationals, and simply discuss with them, how do you pretend that I'm going to be and maintain and invest and create a competitive environment if you're not going to participate in taxes? So I think that it's a balance, and it's a great challenge, and I think that we are winning, because these countries, these multinationals, are realizing that you just can't have a free ride. You have to be, you must invest in those societies so that those societies will bring back the people that you need, well-trained, bilingual, the infrastructure that you need to be competitive, certainty, security, etc. So I think that it's a balance. Competitive rates on one side, and the willingness of the foreign direct investor to participate by paying a competitive rate of tax.
Well, let me make a comment regarding your question. Yeah, I think we face a problem that I think also is common in other countries in Latin America. We have this system of taxation that used to rely too much on external trade, on exports and imports. It was 70% on customs and 30% of internal revenues. That was the pattern. The traditional model of economic development based on exports of traditional products, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, coffee, and then imports, practically everything. But then in the 90s, when the process of liberalization started, late 80s, mid-80s, late 80s, and 90s, the pattern of development changed, and there was a liberalization of trade. And the preach of, from the US, from the World Bank, from the other financial institutions telling us, you have to liberalize your market, you have to open your market, you have to reduce your how do you say, the arancel?
Reduce the import duties.
The duties, import and export duties. And then we face a major challenge because we unilaterally, in 1990, for instance, unilaterally reduced significantly our duties. And so the revenues for the government decrease considerably. But the need for public funding was ever greater because we went through the debt crisis. You were supposed to have your fiscal house in order. You couldn't run fiscal deficit, otherwise the IMF will come to you because there was a ever-growing social needs in the country. And the government actually increased its size because of democratic change. There was more participation and so on and so forth. So there was a transition from an external trade, taxation based on external trade, on more based on internal revenues. And that's where the problem has arisen, because now the pattern has changed. It's 30% external and 70% coming from inside the country, internal revenues. Income tax, consumption tax, and property tax, and other type of taxes. Now, the thing is that there is a history of evasion, fraud, corruption in the tax system. So it's not only changing the law. It's not only saying now I'm going to reduce your duties for imports or exports. Now you're going to pay more income tax, or you're going to pay 60% of IVA or ITEVIS, as we call it, for consumption. But somebody will have to collect that, and then collection dropped because there was no strong institution to make this happen. So together with the change in the law, there was a need to change an institution that could be able to sustain the fiscal base of the state. In the Dominican Republic, if there is one area in which you have made progress, I would say, in terms of not only of making the state stronger and collecting taxes, but also reducing evasion and corruption, I would point that one probably is number one. Is there has been incredible change, very positive change. Well, in the sense that everybody is pretty much having to pay the taxes. And the rich and the oligarchical sector that, you know, they only had free ride, now they're paying taxes and they complain. The question is, what my colleague was talking about, whether you were competitive with some of the rates that we have. Because, you know, income tax at 35%, consumption taxes at 16%, and it's high. You know, it's high, and people feel it and resent it. And then, I'm taking too long answering this question, but there is another side of this. The flip side is that as people realize that they're paying taxes, because before we didn't see it. It was somewhere else. When the products were coming in, it was taxed in custom, and you didn't see it. You didn't pay in the bill. Now you pay in the bill when you go to a restaurant, when you go to a store, or you pay your income tax or your property tax. Now the citizenry are demanding more transparency and efficiency from the government. We're not there yet, but people are beginning to complain because now they're more conscious, more aware that if there money that has been spent in doing this and that. And I think I begin to perceive a more active and critical population in terms of what the government is doing with their money. For me, it's one of the major challenges that we have, how to make the government more accountable to the people, so every penny that comes in is explained how it's spent, and is one of the major reforms that we'll have to carry out in the years ahead.
You're describing an interesting dynamic, because what you're saying is that by enforcing taxes more forcibly, the payment system, people are buying the right to complain.
Mm-hmm.
When they're evading taxes, they can't complain.
Exactly.
One, they don't want to be found out, but two, they're not paying their share, so they have, you know, if you steal food from the grocery store, you can't complain about the quality, right? So once you start paying for it, you can complain. Mm-hmm. So you have enforced taxes so that now people are paying it and they're demanding more of government, and created a cycle of reform, really.
Yeah, it's just beginning.
Okay.
It's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. I perceive that kind of attitude in the general population. In the case of the Dominican Republic, is more, you can see more because of the state institutions were very weak. It's different. Costa Rica, Ambassador Dueñas can talk about that, but I think it has a stronger state. Chile, for instance, is a very strong state. It functions very well, you know. But there are countries in the region, and the Dominican Republic is one of them, that traditionally have had very weak state institutions. So there was much leeway for fraud, evasion, or people just getting away with not paying taxes. Now that the state is after them, is that when the dynamic takes place between the population and the state institutions.
There's another, if I may, there's another phenomenon associated with taxes. In the case of Costa Rica, the private sector asked the government for the new tax law. And that's very, very unusual, and I'll tell you why. It's because, once again, within the institutional reform framework, one of the principal things that you want to achieve is it to be simple, for it to be understandable, and at the same time, for the benefit of the lawyers, enforceable. Okay. And those three things create, or are part, very importantly, of what you call certainty. And you want that to be sustainable. That's another magic word, sustainability of the system. And so in Costa Rica, sometimes, all governments are always complaining that they don't have enough taxes, that the revenues are not enough to be able to sustain the expectancy of the population. And so in Costa Rica, we have had a very strong discussion on saying, look, we want we want a new tax. We are willing to accept a new tax code with two principles. One, that it would be competitive, and the second, it would be general. Because you mentioned something that happens a lot in our countries, and it is in the case of Costa Rica, 80% of the revenues is paid by 500 companies. And so, and in the case of our family's company, we are one of the 500. We are sick and tired of paying for the rest of the society. So actually, we were able to convince people and within the government and say, look, why don't you make a simple proposal for a new tax code, but then extend this in the enforcement. And so it's very, very interesting. And the numbers, as usual, come out that if you reduce the tax in Costa Rica by half, you're going to get about 2.5 times more revenue with a lower income rate.
What we have, I know, I'm sure you have all the questions, but this is a critical issue. In Latin America, the problem is that we have, on the one hand, experiences of mismanagement of the economy, cycles of mismanagement, cycle of good management, but an accumulation of external debt that you have to serve. You know, you can't get away with just not paying your debt. Internationally, you'll be in big trouble. You know that. You'll be a pariah. You know, people, you know, international organizations, banks, and so on and so forth, who say that country don't do business with that country. It's in default. You can't afford to default your payment. And you have excessive external debt that you have to serve. And you do it by taxing the people. And then you have things that have to do with subsidies of sometimes distorted forms of subsidies, because to let the market work will be disastrous. And the price of electricity, for instance, in my country, the price of gas for cooking. Otherwise, if you don't sustain those prices, people will stop using gas and will go to cut trees and will have a major problem, environmental problem. So you have that burden of a subsidy that takes a lot of your income. And then you have what we call the social debt, poverty, communities that are isolated, or communities that don't have the basic infrastructure. They're always demanding basic infrastructure, let alone more sophisticated things. And then running the state as such is becoming, all these reforms that we're talking about have made the state more expensive to run the state. Because now you have an electoral institution that wants to have its own money and autonomously use the money. And the judicial sector also has an autonomy in using its money. The decentralization process have come that they need the money to also to not to depend on the central government, and so on and so forth. There is a proliferation of semi-autonomous institutions. They're all demanding resources. So there is a need of more revenues. And that's where this point that Ambassador Dueña is talking about, that you need all those revenues to do all the things, and still you need more actually. But then at the point that because you're taxing the people too much and the business too much, you may get into a revolving door. But nobody has the courage to really go deep into this and say, let's do it, because everybody's fear that if you reduce income tax or consumption tax, your revenues will drop. And if the revenues will drop, then you'll be in big trouble serving your debt or running the state or serving the people in the social needs and this and that. So that's the kind of dilemma we're facing.
We still have some time. Oh, of course, Q&A. I didn't think about that. I'm not the only one with questions here. Why don't we do that? Let's open it up and let these folks. I do want to just suggest that you think about something for closing, and a little bit we do, which is we've got an audience full of professors and future professors who will be sharing things with years worth of students. What would you wish that they were telling their students about institutional change? But don't answer that yet. We'll save that to close and open it up to the floor.
Two reformed economies here. One thing I haven't heard of that I really reform, and I think what I'm hearing is a strong trend towards a liberal market economy, which has been on for more than a decade now. When you change tax rates and so on, we should expect certain types of structural changes in the economy. What has happened in terms of mix of goods and services offered, investment in higher education, for example, building up of human capital, all those sorts of things?
Well, the case of Costa Rica is one in which we have been investing in human capital since 1850. We have the highest percentage of literacy and education in Latin America, and the highest healthcare system also. So, because our founders were very social minded, they were educated not in the US or in Mexico, that was the education of the time, but they were educated in England and in France. So they came back with the coffee proceeds, and they began to build a liberal society, if you want, in which education was very, very prominent. And Costa Rica invested in education, or has invested very, very strongly. At one point, frankly, we asked ourselves, is it worthwhile? Because foreign direct investment at the time in the region was coming to places that offered the lowest rate per hour. And with the social net that we had in Costa Rica, we could not compete. But all of a sudden, and thanks to your minds and your generation, the age of information came about. And so, and information, the internet, computers, etc., connect countries, connect societies, connect companies, connect needs, and these companies, and they become multinational very strongly. They want to be competitive, and they need smart, educated people. So we find now that the most important structural backbone of Costa Rica, and it continues to attract foreign direct investment in a very successful way, is the educational process. Now we have a challenge, which is how can we make our education bilingual? Because a conversation of English is much different from technical English. And there's a huge change in the world going on in services, as you know. And that's going to be one of the future of the world. The service industry is growing at a rate that not even the industrial one grew. So the services around the world are going to be very, very relevant. So Costa Rica is trying to make very strong investment in a second generation of education, which would be particularly bilingual. That's one of the principles.
In our case, I would say that we're some distance from Costa Rica in that regard. Costa Rica has been the model or the source of inspiration as to where to go in terms of investing in the people, investing in education, health services, social security, and so on and so forth. And the indicators of human development are there. Every year when they come out, you see Costa Rica right at the top among all Latin American countries. In the case of the Dominican Republic, the economic model changed from a traditional model of exports-imports, as I mentioned before, based on 3, 4, 5 major crops and some limited form of industrialization, mostly directed to the internal market, also called the import substitution model, to a more service-oriented economy. That has to do with, of course, tourism. It's been since the mid-80s incredible development of the tourist sector. The so-called maquilas, we don't call it maquilas, in Mexico they call it maquilas, is the free zone that we develop a sector connected to the U.S. economy, exporting apparel, jewelry, medical devices, and a number of products. And we did very, very well in that area in the 90s and up to recently. But competition from Asia is hitting us hard, very, very hard in the textile apparel industry. And also, we have an incipient development of a high-tech sector with certain support from the state and the vision of the president. He created a cyber park and has created an incentive, fiscal incentive for companies to come and experiment in creation of software, biotechnology, and they have interesting things of business incubator, people who come with ideas, get some support. But I think that for us to be successful, and in those areas, we need to really keep investing in human capital. And this is a question of public debate. It was debated in the electoral campaign now. People are very aware of this. But all the constraints that we have in the budget for all I said, the progress is being slow. But there is a awareness in the government and everybody else that's the key to development.
Other challenges, by the way, are infrastructure. In the case of Costa Rica, once again, countries are like companies now. They have to be competitive, and one of their assets is the physical infrastructure. And in the case of Costa Rica, we are also reforming telecommunication and insurance, thanks to CAFTA, which were in the hands of the government, and now we are going to be able to invite other companies to compete. So there are great challenges in Latin America and in our countries in particular in physical infrastructure also.
I know there are other questions, but now that you mentioned telecommunication and the Dominican Republic didn't go through the state control the telecommunication industry and other type of industry like insurance and things like that. So we were ready when the technological revolution came about. We were ready to develop that sector through competition, and we were far ahead of other countries in terms of a world-class communication sector. You'll be amazed when you find that.
You mentioned that family companies do borrow 80% of taxes in the country. Are those typically family-owned businesses? And in the case that they are, do you think that they are going to be able to affect by the government because of the fact that they are in that sense? And if so, how do you address that? How do you affect? Because I guess only America and England are countries that don't have a majority of family-owned businesses in the context of the companies that they control. So how do you control those kind of companies? How do you get them to instigate and implement the change that governments want?
You are very right, and 95%, almost 95% of the companies in Latin America are family-owned. Now, once again, those who really want to become members of the real world have to be competitive. And in order to be competitive, you have to be able to strip yourself away of any kind of help. That's at least our position, my position, what has been always my position in our family-owned business. If you want to be competitive, you have to strip yourself away of every single incentive, because incentives weaken you in the end. I'm not satanizing incentives, but certainly, I'm sure that you have seen this happen many, many times. Incentives can become part of the business. And if you incorporate an incentive in part of the business, you are denaturalizing that business. And then when you have to compete in terms with the rest of the world, you are going to be weakened. You're going to have to be depending on something that you did not have time to build on. So you find, Alicia, you find both tendencies in family-owned companies in our countries. Some that want to maintain that control, they want to maintain the incentives, they want to maintain the protectionism, they want to maintain their vested interests. But the others that want to go beyond, the region of Central America, that want to go into the Caribbean, South America, that want to even be able to open up some type of a business in the US, are preparing and are rather successful in preparing their companies for what I call the real world. Yes.
One thing that seems consistent in both of your comments was that, in some sense, regulatory reform institutional change seems to be made to global audience. So there are banks and multilateral institutions, there are other countries very aware of what they're doing. So in some sense, it seems like these reforms are adopted because of the pressures that come from the outside. Is that in any way reflective of or causing tensions domestically, where interests might actually be different from what it is from the pressures that arise internationally?
And the ambassador of Costa Rica, Ambassador Dueñas, mentioned in the experience of his country the external factor in triggering internal reforms. And when he said that, I thought about my own country, which is probably a clearer case of external influence in triggering reforms, both in the economic area and in the political area. We transition to democracy has been the result of external pressure in some circumstances. So electoral reform, for instance, in major crisis, and pressure from the US, from other actors in the international community. In a positive sense, because that's how advancing democracy. In previous experience, the external influence was negative, and intervention, military intervention, and things like that. In the economic sector, the same. In the economic areas as well, sometimes it's been the result of a major economic crisis, and then you have to bring the IMF in, and they come with a set of recipes for reform, and then you have to do what you have to do. That's that, to put your house in order. And sometimes it has to do with decisions that the country itself has taken, but it involves external actors, such as the CAFTA. It's a free trade agreement. Then it generates a dynamic of changes that you have to do because it's the only way to be part of that scheme. Changes in, for instance, in customs, in laws regarding government procurement and purchasing and hiring and all that. Now, internal resistance, we haven't experienced radical rebellion, radical positions with a massive audience in the country as a result of being resented for that type of external influence. Different from other countries where you feel that type of radicalization, anti-globalization, anti-capitalism, anti-USA. In the case of the Dominican Republic, that has not been the case. I would say that probably the resistance has been more in the traditional business sectors, the more oligarchical groups that were all those vested interests, than in sectors of the population in general. So there has been some reaction, but no, as has been the case in other countries where you find kind of radical position against everything that represents globalization, capitalism, liberalization, US, and so on and so forth.
I'm going to surprise you, quite the contrary in Costa Rica. Although Costa Rica exports 40% of its gross national product to the US, imports 52% of what it needs. 65% of the foreign direct investment is American, and 60% of the tourists that come to Costa Rica are American. We have had 2 years of discussion to join CAFTA. So that is resistance at its best. And the resistance has come as a consequence of many things. And so you must try to make an effort as professors. And I think that this is part of what I was going to say at the end, but anyway, you must try to make try to differentiate between what society can afford with what society should be. Because today, many reformers are proposing structural changes that countries cannot afford. And in that name, because of the inability of a country to be able to reform or to leap, not jump, but just leap into the future, then they're saying, well, we don't want anything less than that. And so you come to a standstill. That was happening in Costa Rica. It would be, like you people say in English, a no-brainer for Costa Rica to join CAFTA. But still, we had to go to a national referendum. The first time in the history of trade in the world that a country has to go to a national referendum to vote yes or no on a free trade agreement with the US. And what happened? Well, we ran into interests of the academic community that don't like globalization. We ran into interests of the Catholic Church that don't want globalization or don't want to lose the control of their flock. And I'm a Catholic. You found yourself surrounded also by anti-globalization, anti-China, anti-Americans, anti-everything. And they got together and by the way, influenced and financed by some of our fellow governments that are interested in driving a wedge between the United States and certain other Latin American countries that want to become independent in a way, or want to develop in the right way, if you want. And so Costa Rica, you had Fidel Castro writing from his sick bed about CAFTA and about the heroic Costa Ricans that were resisting and encouraging Costa Ricans to resist joining the U.S. in a trade agreement. So once again, as formers of opinion that you will be, it must be distinguished, and you have to sometimes go deeper into really the effects of trade, of globalization, etc. It's a great challenge.
Sounds like the curse of political development.
Is a strong constituency in favor of introducing the new constitution, all those forms of direct democracy, referendum, plebiscite, how do you say in English, revocación del mandato, recalling the elected officer. There's an experience in Venezuela, and now it's going to take place in Bolivia. There is a strong demand for that. Incredible in every sector of society, but especially in people more organized, people who are more actively involved in politics or in civil society organizations or in trade unions or in environmental groups and women groups and so on and so forth. So we are now in a dilemma. We either go that way, which probably we will, of incorporating all these institutions, and then there will be frustration because of what you're saying. Because it's very difficult to manage all this expectation and to bring people to a kind of a rational, middle of the road position regarding all this institutional reform. And that we are now in that debate, definitely. For the minority who think like me, that we have to strengthen representative democracy and try to improve the system that we have instead of bringing a new system with a lot of mechanisms that ultimately will not solve any problem. Then we are, kind of preaching every day, but, without getting much audience. But let's see what comes out of that. It's very popular in Latin America, all those constitutional changes of all these participatory, and it sounds good. I mean, you feel good about it, and it seems that all the excluded sectors of society, which indeed have been excluded, a lot of people have been excluded, because our societies have been very divided in terms of income, in terms of power, in terms of resources. That's the background that serve, as a context for all these reforms. So people say, well, we were excluded, then we have to have this type of institutional mechanism to participate practically on a daily basis of exercising government. But we know that government today, with the complex of running a country, the complex of the world economy, with the complex of running the state, it's not a question of everybody making decisions every day. It's a question of having institutions that work effectively, that represent the people, that are accountable and transparent, and people have a say every once and then to elect their authorities. Camila?
Well, piggybacking a little bit on that question, actually, I actually come from a developing country, Colombia, and I feel that one of the major challenges we've had in implementing change is the lack of credibility in our institutions. So as much as the change is needed, and as much as we know that eventually society will actually go along with it, the lack of credibility in that government as an institution, not the actual president right now, just in general, lack of credibility in government and political parties makes it so much harder to achieve that change. Did you have to go through the process of actually building some credibility before you get some of the change done?
Well, I think it's simultaneously. It's ideally you go through that type of rebuilding trust and credibility, and then you say, let's go about changing some of the institutions. But in the real world, it doesn't work that way. But I see your point. For those of us who are trying to defend not existing as such, but pretty much the design of a representative democracy, there is the need to work harder to make the government institutions to work better for the people, so that credibility increases, the trust increases, and then you have more credibility towards the population that wants more radical changes in institutional design. That's the question: how to balance that real need of participation from people who have been excluded with the institutional design that will make the country governable, that will make it work and not create more problems that it already has. But that need of participation exists. People have been excluded, living in poverty, excluded of everything. So, but there is this kind of a romantic idea that somehow, if you create all these institutions, then you're going to be able to turn the page and start a new day. And I go back to my original point of incrementalism, of making the institutions work through changes that are less heroic, because it's not like you change everything. You're going to change small things incrementally, improving human capital, improving the way the institutions work, reducing corruption, improving the services that the state provides to the citizens, and so on and so forth. So that's my modest approach to these reforms.
One more question and then.
Yeah.
You were last.
One thing that I've been fascinated with is how it seems like the views towards globalization go in cycles in different parts of the world. I mean, I see that in the United States a lot. Right now with the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton saying that we should take a time out from free trade and NAFTA, or Obama says renegotiate. I'm from Mexico, so I don't know exactly what that means, but it concerns me a bit. Concerns me because the U.S. was pushing for NAFTA a lot, and now this happens. I mean, with CAFTA, for example, is there a concern that the U.S. might change its mind later and say, oh, maybe we didn't want this? Putting your hands too much into a business partner that may later change their mind.
Let me begin, Luis, by saying that, and I have no qualms about saying it on the record, if the United States pulls out of NAFTA, if they have a concern that there are 12 million people here that are undocumented, they're going to have to multiply that by 3 the next day. So that's one thing that I think that doesn't mean that you are always happy with what you negotiate. Negotiation is a game. It's a very tough game. You have a blue-eyed, blonde American guy from the USTR on the other side of the table, and he wants to eat you up, and then you're trying to do the same. And so that's the nature of negotiation. So I think that everyone would like a better trade agreement, and you have the means of bettering trade agreements because the new generation, including NAFTA, although NAFTA is a little generation before CAFTA. CAFTA is a much stronger. It has a lot of salt and pepper in there. But still, NAFTA is a very, very powerful one because you have been able to put together three economies that together are 20% of the GDP of the world, for Christ's sake. So that's very, very powerful. And, I think that, unfortunately, talking about NAFTA lightly isn't a good thing. But anyway, going back to CAFTA, with what we hear today in Congress, this is a very bad time for trade, and we may well fall into a time like during the administrations of Mr. Clinton, where after NAFTA nothing else happened. And the world needs trade with the U.S. and the U.S. needs trade with the rest of the world because you people want to be competitive. You want to be able to negotiate the best terms, to interchange services and goods and people and this and that. And trade is a good thing. But unfortunately, trade which has affected many people that are very loud. We do not hear about the 200 million people that have come out of poverty in the last 5 years, precisely because of free trade. But it has become a political pawn, and in many places. And so we have to make a great effort to defend, in the proper way, the proper framework of trade, which at the end conducts to development of everyone.
Very briefly, I'd like to comment that I'm worried that nowadays the debate here, what you hear is that whoever is a progressive, to put it some way, becomes is synonymous of being anti-trade, anti-globalization, and that split worries me because you can be progressive, socially and politically, and be pro-trade. The experience of Chile is one that I tend to mention because it has a government that is progressive since the end of the dictatorship of Pinochet, and they have been the most open economy unilaterally and through bilateral trades and multilateral trade agreements. So you can be progressive and also be pro-trade. And now everybody who is progressive is automatically, without thinking much about it, becomes synonymous of being anti-trade, anti-US, anti-globalization, and so on and so forth. That's one point. Another point is that we kind of, from Latin America, we get really worried when you hear that they're going to renegotiate NAFTA. Because, I mean, the US is the most powerful country in the world. They sat in the table with the most competent negotiators that you can imagine, with the Mexicans and with the Canadians. But at some point, it was only with the Mexicans. And they're saying that they didn't negotiate this well, that they're going to renegotiate that. If they say that with respect to Mexico, let alone with respect to Central American countries and the Dominican Republic. So that signal is a little bit problematic for us. They're a little bit problematic, to say the least.
Well, let me ask. I'm guessing, 100 students each per year for 10 years. We're looking at 20, 30,000 people that this group is going to talk to over the next 10 years. In 2 minutes, what's one thing you would have them get out to that 20 or 30,000 potential policymakers?
Well, I wish I could change seats. Now, one of you would say, I see here you become an ambassador and I go back to school. that to go back to academia is a good experience to be there. And I would say simply that the beauty of being in academia is that you are free thinkers and you examine issues and critically and inquiry things and trying to come up with, not with the truth, which that doesn't exist, but at least with different versions of the truth and and make your students and yourself think harder and look at things always with a fresh perspective. So I would say just keep doing that, which is the essence of academic life. Think critically, make your students think hard without any type of preconditions or preconceived ideas about Latin America. Prevent your students to become very moralistic towards our countries, because from the developed world, that's what you perceive. People who think they have all the solutions in their hands and know everything, and they want to come down and tell us what to do. Just coach them if they're going to get a job as consultant, or they're going to get a job at the USAID or in some US agency, just to be, modest in their approach, to be critical, and avoid any type of condescendence, patronizing, some moralistic perspective towards our country, and treat us with respect and dignity. And if you're going to study Latin America and our countries, I am assuming that some of you will be doing that.
Well said, well said. I would very briefly like to thank you for this opportunity of talking with you, because it's been a great honor, and also it makes us think in a very serious way, because you people have achieved intellectually and academically. Of course, you have achieved the great level of formers of opinion, and that is very important, and I congratulate you. I would like to end by saying that that to me, institutional reform is absolutely fundamental for countries. It is the backbone of a country. Because once again, if you don't have certainty, if you don't have a set of rules that are equal for everyone, and you don't have a framework there, there are so many countries that are in the planet that you simply are not going to be able to make it. And then in that framework, 2 or 3 issues are key. The first is that framework of institutions has to be competitive. Countries compete. It's not a romantic word. They compete to death. Is Intel going to come to Costa Rica, or is it going to go to Brazil or Mexico? And it came to Costa Rica. 1. 2. The institutional framework has to be a simple one, in the sense that it has to be well understood, easy to explain, and easy to enforce. And number 3, there's a vital element for countries to have today to form that credibility, and it is accountability. That's a magic word also. You have to make a permanent effort from the side of private sector or of the public sector. You must hopefully teach your alumnos, your students, to be accountable, because that is a basis of a well-balanced society.
Very good.
Please join me in thanking our panel tonight.
Thank you.